I'm Mac Sandlin. I'm a theologian who loves art.
I'm Tessa Davidson. I'm an artist who loves theology.
And this is Our First Word.
Theology of Beauty. The year is 726, and if we were to go to Constantinople, we would hear about this decree of Leo III, who has issued this decree against icons. And what we would see is the removal of this beautiful image of Jesus that had been placed along this gate, this main gate, the palace gate there in Constantinople. And in its place would be, they put up this image of the cross. And with the cross was another statement that said this: the Lord does not allow the fashioning of an image of Christ that is lifeless and without breath, made of earthly matter, despised by the sacred writings. And so this inscription here is actually referencing a few things, one of which I think is an echo of the Second Commandment. Mac, why don't you read the Second Commandment?
I'll read it in the King James because it sounds fancy. Thou shalt not make unto thyself any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generations of them that hate me.
What do we do with this?
Well, I guess we better quit making pictures of God.
Yeah. Well, back at 726, that's what they started doing.
So maybe tell us about the history book. So that's 726. We're in the end of the Roman age. We're getting into the Middle Ages here. They were making images before that. They had images, certainly of Christ.
Yeah.
When do we start making images of Christ? When did Christians first start drawing pictures or sculpting things of Christ? Do you know when that begins?
Well, I'm fascinated in just early Christian art and tracing that back and seeing some of the early portrayals of some of these stories and how Christians grabbed a hold of visual language. Really, some of the earliest images that we can trace back are not until 2nd, 3rd century. So, and that's in places like the Catacombs and these places, where they would bury their dead. And there were a lot of scholars that kind of were mystified by this. Why don't we see a lot of earlier images from the 1st century? But once you start really like peeling away the layers and recognizing the context, seeing the persecution, it really isn't until Christians and Christianity became legal and where they were able to have the resources to be able to devote themselves to the making of religious images and structures. But once that is cleared away, then there's this like rich like renaissance and like outpouring of all of these images. And so I think early Christianity has a very rich visual tradition, but you have to recognize just the constraints of persecution.
So you think because they're being persecuted and because there's a financial thing, you think part of this, you said, like they don't have the resources?
Yeah, like nowadays people think, oh, you can just go out and draw things. Like back then, you were so limited in who could actually go out and make things. These materials that you would paint with are precious materials, and it's very limited as far as who got to make things. And these were very, very costly and expensive. So really, in the history of art, you're only talking about the wealthiest people, the kings that could commission works. And so when Christianity is legal and Christians are having to hide in secret, you're not going to have just a strong outpouring of lots of visual imagery.
So when I think about early ones that I've seen, early images, or even images associated with Christianity, the fish, but Christ as the shepherd, right?
Yeah,
this very old image of Christ as the shepherd. But the other one, the one that I've always been intrigued by, is not Christian art, right? The Alexamenos Graffito, right? This is the picture. It's like a piece of graffiti, and it's Christ on the cross, but he has a donkey's head.
Yeah.
And it's mocking a Christian and saying,
right.
he worships this donkey, this crucified, shameful sort of thing. So it's interesting that these very early images, some of them are not from Christians at all. They're from people mocking Christians. Though that one's become later, famous later on as like Christians saying, yeah, look, the wisdom of God is foolishness to men. The strength of God, or the weakness of God is greater than the strength of men.
Yeah.
So there's some powerful things about this in like what early Christians are doing and also what early Christian opponents are doing.
Yeah.
Do you think that the early reticence toward making images, making art, making sculpture, that kind of thing, does it tie to the Second Commandment, to the Jewish heritage of the church? I mean, the early church is predominantly Jewish as well. There's a shift from a majority Jewish church to a majority Gentile church. Is that involved in the...
I think some historians would say that it is, and I think there could be a case to be made. But even if we look to Jewish practice, well, they were filling the tabernacle and the temple with images. So it's not that we're like pointing to a tradition that was iconoclastic, in the sense of that they didn't use images and mediate ideas through images.
Yeah, this is relevant. Sometimes we talk about like images or picture, like even the word image or the word icon or the word idol, which is all the same. The word for don't make any graven images. It's just icon. Like, it's not just that we don't have Christian icons or pictures of Christ or of God. We don't have them of the Good Samaritan or the parables that Jesus told or anything like that. Is that right?
From
like first 2 centuries, yeah.
Yeah, but we don't have a lot of images of a lot of things, but I
mean that seems relevant to the point, right?
Right.
It's not merely that they're avoiding making images of God. We just don't have much visual imagery from them because because they're an oppressed people. And also a small people, not as Paul says in Corinthians. Not many of you were wise. Not many of you were noble. Not many of you were of high prestige in the society that it would take to make this kind of stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
But when they get more of that, and then also in like burial chambers, where we're going down here. Sometimes even poor people will spend time or money to decorate or engrave or whatever tombs. We start seeing it.
Yeah, and we get a sense that it wasn't just mere. I mean, I just kind of chafe a little bit about like decoration because I think it was more even to them. Because if you look at the imagery and what they chose for their images, you get a sense that they were transmitting ideas and theological concepts through their images. They were using it as a witness, as a testimony, as a pedagogy for how to shape the next generation, because they were very selective about what kind of subject matter and what that would then communicate. So, for example, you're right. Like you don't see images of Christ on the cross. Like that's absent from the early first several centuries. You see it come up in the 5th century, an image of Christ on the cross, but it's not of him like hanging there in pain and dead. Like he looks alive and victorious. But what you see in the catacombs are selective images of people that have overcome trials and temptations, and you see more of like hints of resurrection. And so resurrection is a prominent theme throughout all of the images that we see in the catacombs.
Yeah, and it's more central to the Christian proclamation early.
Exactly, yeah.
So you're saying that the art is not merely, as modern folks we might say, art for art's sake, but rather art for the sake of, as you said, pedagogy, teaching.
Yeah.
These are visual sermons that they're crafting.
Yeah, we've got an early tradition within Christianity that showcases that.
So that happens. You start having, you said, cruciform images, crucifixes and such in the late Roman period, early medieval period, 500s, you said, something like that?
Yeah, and I think, and even backing up, I think we could make a case even within the 1st century. We, just with the fact that we've got Christians gathering together and using symbols like the Lord's Supper and these visual symbols and how they would stand up and pray in like the cruciform posture. These are all ways in which the church is mediated by imagery and thinking about images and their faith. So I think, I mean, I just want to be careful, maybe like the painting and the fine arts that we come to know and we make these connections with images, you don't see that, until the 3rd or 4th century when you have access to those materials and the finances. But I would say deep within Christianity is still a rich icon tradition.
Well, that's an important word that you just threw out there, Ron. I mean, when I went to my PhD program at a Catholic school, one of the words that I learned, I mean, I knew the word, but learned as a sort of central piece of theological reflection was mediation. Mediation. That is, that if God is going to come to us, if God is going to reveal himself to us, he can only do so through some means. There is no, this is a very, I think a controversial sort of statement to make in a Protestant setting, but there is no unmediated experience of God. There is no unmediated revelation.
Yes.
Right? If God is going to speak to people, he must speak in a language we're already mediating. Something that humans created, something that humans make, right?
Right.
Sounds and so forth. God has to use a language. And if he's going to appear, the forms in which we have these theophanies in the Old Testament, these appearances of God, fire in a bush that is not being consumed. It's not an image, so to speak, right, in quotes or something, but it is an artistic presentation, a creative thing where God is like, I'll be like fire that ought to consume the bush that I'm in, but doesn't. Just like I'll be the holy God in the middle of the people of Israel. They ought to be consumed, but they're not. So we've got this image that God is revealing himself in, and it is symbolic. It points beyond itself to some important truth about God and the people. When God comes to have dinner with Abraham, he comes as three travelers. And then later on, these are angels, and this one is the Lord. You know, there's all sort of ways that we can start interpreting these, or these, pre-incarnate Christophanies and things like that. But when God shows up, he shows up in some sort of mediated form, whether it's fire or darkness or a flaming, smoking pot or a burning bush or wind or water, or all these different symbolic images that we encounter via text. But of course, Moses didn't encounter that via text. He encountered it as a sort of piece of performance art.
Right. Yeah.
That he meets. So this idea of mediation, to me, is pretty important, because I think sometimes Christians, and especially Protestant Christians, tend to want direct access to God. They don't want any mediation. The Lord's Supper is only just a sort of sign or symbol that points toward something, but the real encounter happens utterly divorced from the tangible physical elements in the Zwinglian tradition in Protestant theology. Baptism, this is a mere sort of act of obedience disconnected from any presence of God in Zwingli's tradition. And I think that one thing I have always appreciated in Churches of Christ, who are sort of like Protestant and then hyper-Protestant in a way that almost brings us back closer to some of the older traditions, is to say, well, in Scripture, God is always showing up to the people through material things. The Ark of the Covenant is a great example of this. Baptism is a great example of this. The elements of the Lord's Supper are a great example of this. Even the creation of the world.
Yeah, that's how we're speaking all the time. And we forget what life is like before the printing press and before people have access to text, and how, we, in general, how we mediate our world and come to experience and know God. It's all through so many other forms and ways, but yeah, we are people of the word, and so we often will show preference to the written word and the written text over other ways.
Or spoken, right? Written or spoken, yeah. Okay, so the early Christians don't make much visual art, but they are still emphasizing mediation in a sense of like the sacraments as performance art. Body posture, you mentioned in prayer, as a sort of performance art. There's a mediating thing that comes through these physical elements. And then they start painting, and they do, I think, paintings first, drawings and paintings first.
And sculpture.
And then move on to reliefs and sculptures pretty quickly after that. Is that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so tell me more about the like subject matter, You said the cross comes later
Fifth
and
century,
resurrection is earlier?
Right. Yeah. And even with the cross is that emphasis on resurrection. So yeah, you usually see portrayals of Christ as this shepherd, and also in the early Christian period, they're trying to find their language in a way, their visual language. And so they're like kind of mapping on to recognizable images and forms that their culture would understand. And so, they might show Christ in a way that you could associate with Apollo, and then that opens up conversations. So they might portray angels in a way that also shows, like Nike, the goddess of victory. And so they're going to show, winged angels, even though that's not what the text describes as angels, but they're bringing that visual vocabulary in because it relates to their culture. And so it's always being mediated by culture and our context. And it's interesting at how sometimes that has carried over into now we can't think of an angel without thinking about, a Nike figure. Or
You see
wings.
those things online, like a meme that's like biblically accurate angel, and it looks like a monster out of a Dungeons and Dragons monster manual or something. Let me play devil's advocate here for a minute. I think you and I are both pretty open to a role of religious art. We're going to talk about that some more through this podcast. Let me play devil's advocate. Someone might say, yeah, early Christianity doesn't do this precisely because it's the Roman influence. It's the Greco-Roman, or I think they'll say the pagan influence that comes in and corrupts the church such that we start making angels that look like Greek gods instead of what they look like in the biblical text. And this tradition is just bad. This is the church falling away and corrupting, and that's why it increases the further you get from the first century. Then it distorts what the Bible said and what the early Christians proclaimed. How do you respond to that sort of critique, or do you think there's something to that?
Well, I think I would just press that and say, well, what is the Bible saying? What do you think the Bible is saying with the second command? Because some people will hold that up and say, well, God says not to make any image. But then if you flip over a few pages, then tells them to fill the tabernacle with imagery. So what?
Pomegranates.
Exactly.
And
So, I mean, I guess you would I would press them a little bit to say, well, what do you think the Bible's claims are with images? Because I would contend that no, there's a lot of images throughout Judaism. And even when we think about God becoming image, I mean, it just doesn't make sense to maintain that we have this iconoclastic tradition up until the 3rd century, because we don't see that in the Old Testament. We don't see that in the image of Christ. I don't know if I'm really kind of getting to the.
No, I think I think that you're on. I think that that's relevant, and maybe we should say for listeners who aren't into the class maybe as much, iconoclast means a destroyer of images.
Yeah, the breaking of images.
Break an image, classically a smashing of an idol, like how Gideon smashes the idol of Baal in the book of Judges.
And an iconophile is somebody that, it wants to maintain. And
a friend, a lover of an image, yeah. So that seems right, that there's the use of artistry, creativity, various images, but not images for God.
Yeah, okay.
And that seems important. And even there's a reticence isn't there a reticence in Christian art, even once it starts to depict God, until, most things, I think, pictures of God as, an old man in the sky that become very common later tend to be later. Is that right?
Yeah, and so you're actually touching on something that I have struggled with myself, and I've just even in my own work, I've gone back and forth with where I stand on this issue, and I'm still not fully, it's not like I've come away and I'm just I've got this all figured out, because it's something that I'm humbled by, because throughout all of the Old Testament, God continually says, don't make an image of me. Don't make an image of me. I don't exist in that that image that you carve of other gods. And that was very common, and idolatry was very prevalent. And so we do have that command that goes throughout all of Scripture, and even in the temple and the Holy of Holies, and where you have the mercy seat, there's no where they would normally place the God, that's empty, and instead they sprinkle blood, which I think actually is a pretty interesting foreshadowing. And we get this in Hebrews, that where Christ is going to say, I am that image, that sacrifice that you were pointing to. So I think a good question is how should we handle images of God the Father, who is spirit? Yesterday I was talking to my art appreciation class about, we were looking at the creation of Adam, Michelangelo's famous fresco painting.
With the hands.
Right. Yeah. And you see that he was trying to portray God the Father as strong. So he's got this muscular body. So he's got this strength, but then he also has wisdom, so he's got this like long white beard. I can see how Michelangelo was trying to point to these characteristics of God that he wanted to affirm, and we can't help but to sometimes wrap visual language, even language that kind of conjures up ideas in our heads. I think it's a natural thing for us to do. But at the same time, one thing that troubles me when I see images like that is I can't help but to hear my conversations with my atheist friends who will say, well, I don't believe that there's an old man in the sky, to which I want to just affirm and say, I don't either. God is spirit. Like both male and female are made in his image. And so when we put forward images like that, there's going to be some fallout for ways that people think wrongly, or just depending on how those images are used. It can create confusion.
And there's a lie in there, right? I mean,
right.
Sort of like we would say, a bull is strong and a calf is young and energetic. So we use an image of a calf to represent or to point to God. We say, no, don't do that. He's not a calf. It's because the idol, is mute and tells lies or that kind of thing. I think my instinct is that like depictions of the Father are just a mistake in some sense. But it also seems relevant that like, how are you going to forbid the making of images of the Son who did have flesh?
Right.
Right? I mean, Colossians, he is the image of the invisible God.
Right.
The firstborn over all creation. If he is an image, God has become an image to us. How can we not recognize that? And like, I think you would say, we don't make an idol because this lowers God. And then we look at Christ, we go, oh yeah, God has lowered himself. So I had this 3 treatises on the divine images from St. John of Damascus, one of the early writers writing in the middle of the
St. John.
iconoclastic. But he's talking about worshiping God. We'll get to, I think, worship and veneration and whatnot later. But he's talking about, I only give worship to God, he says. He says, I venerate together with the King and God the purple robe of his body. Now, he doesn't mean like a robe that Jesus wore. He means Christ's flesh is like clothing. So he's imagining here that our bodies are like clothing worn by a spirit. We could get into the whole, like, what's the nature of a person? Are we, souls wrapped in a body, or are we our bodies? There's lots of good anthropological debate to happen there. But John is Platonic in this way, like that is like follower of Plato. Plato's thought that spirit and flesh are distinct. So he says the purple robe is a reference to the body. I venerate together with the King and God the purple robe of his body, not as a garment, nor as a fourth person, God forbid, but as called to be and to have become unchangeably equal to God and the source of anointing. For the nature of the flesh did not become divinity, but as the Word became flesh immutably, that is, without change, remaining what it was, so also the flesh became Word, without losing what it was, being rather made equal to God hypostatically. Now, there's some technical terms going on in here with hypostasis, and even the word venerate is technical in sense. But John is trying to get at, look, if the Word became flesh, then you're going to have to say something about that flesh.
Yeah.
And that flesh was made of molecules and atoms. Like, it was a visual thing walking around. It was if God sculpts humanity from the dust of the ground in Genesis, Christ is this. His flesh can die. He can die. And yet, it's also right when he stands there in the flesh for people to bow down and worship him.
Yeah.
And he can say, if you don't eat my flesh, you don't have any part of me. So there's this elevating of the material in regards to Christ's flesh. Now, of course, our depictions of Christ are not the same thing as Christ's flesh. I don't think there's ever been a Christian tradition that's tried to argue anything like that we should worship a picture of Christ or a sculpture of Christ like we worship the flesh of Christ. There's never been a tradition that says that. The closest thing you get is something like transubstantiation in the Catholic Church, in which you might have the bread, the host, that has been consecrated, and then they would say, there's no bread there anymore. It's only the body of Christ. So, of course, you can worship it because it's Christ. But they would never say that about an icon, a picture, a sculpture, a crucifix, anything like that.
Sure.
So how does it hit you? Depictions of Christ versus depictions, as you say, of the Father, or even of like the Word, the sort of the divine nature, as opposed to like when we draw a picture of you're painting a picture of Christ, right?
Yeah.
And when you're doing that, are you painting a picture of the flesh of Christ, or do you think like I'm painting a picture of the Word with the divine essence or something?
Yeah, that's really good. And you're right. Really, St. John of Damascus really kind of pointed out historically how the Incarnation is a game changer. This is like a mic drop moment for the whole history of this debate and how far this has gone. And even with my own practice, there were times where I stopped making images of Jesus because I felt that I don't know what Jesus looked like. And so any portrayal is going to box out somebody or might become a hindrance or a stumbling block to somebody. And we've also just been inundated with the whole like white Jesus, blue eyes, bathrobe kind of a portrayal of Christ. And so there's a part of me that just felt like, well, maybe we shouldn't just depict him at all. But yeah, what St. John of Damascus points out is that in order to communicate that Jesus had a real body, we can't, like, you have to have an image. And even if you want to not have a visual image, you're still having an image in your head.
When you read the Gospels,
and this is why J.I. Packer, he doesn't even make sense when he said, oh, it's just as wrong to have an image in your head because that's breaking the second command. I mean, you can't help but to have an image of a human body in your head if you were to affirm that Jesus had a human body. But one of the pushbacks that they gave even in earlier times is, okay, so you're making just if Jesus has two natures, then the image is just his physical nature. They would then accuse them of being Nestorians, saying, well, no, you're dividing Christ in half. You're not showing his divine nature. And that was the critique. Whereas I believe it was Theodore the Studite that actually came out and said, no, if the disciples were able to see the divine through Christ incarnate, then we can still connect with the divine image of Christ through images without having this like division here, without only seeing in part. There's something that can be mediated through images, and we can get a glimpse into his divine nature as well, even through the images. So I don't think that one should argue that, well, when I'm portraying Christ, I'm only portraying his physical nature, because then maybe, yeah, you are dividing Christ in half. But I think you actually should have your images point to his divine nature as well.
Well, it seems like there's a mindset there, right? But just as if you were to paint a picture of me, you would never say, this is a picture of Mac's soul or his spirit. You'd say the picture is a picture of his flesh, and yet, or his body or whatever, and yet in looking at it, what comes to the mind is the whole.
Yeah,
right?
There it is.
The whole of the person. So we can't make an image in color of the divine nature or of the Word. We can only make an image of the Word when it has become flesh. And then when we look at it, we don't say, oh, I'm only seeing a picture of his flesh and his divinity is separate.
Right.
Rather, it's in the interpretation of the image that we see the fullness of him. Just like people saw Jesus all the time when he walked around and didn't see the Word, right? They were always getting this wrong.
Yeah.
And so we could do that too, right?
Yeah.
We could look like, oh, I only see his flesh. No, then you're not seeing it
Then you're not
correctly,
really seeing it,
right?
yes.
Because the idea is when like art is this window that we're looking through. Back to this, and I think there's something. Of course, also you mentioned J.I. Packer, not an accident. This is a very Protestant, Calvinistic theologian. I'm not trying to hate on Protestants or Calvinism in this conversation, but I am saying there was a hard shift away from mediation from Zwingli, and then it's not quite as strong in Calvin as it is in Zwingli, but then his tradition, I think, becomes much more Zwingli in this way.
Yeah.
Ulrich Zwingli, an early reformer from Zurich. But I think about this phenomenon where we don't want to lower God by making an image or something like that. But as I said earlier, God does that himself in taking on flesh. The same way that Christians have been very reticent to paint Christ on the cross nude.
Yeah.
We know that Romans crucified people nude. The Bible talks about them taking his garments, even his undergarment, the seamless tunic, and casting lots for it. But I know if I'm drawing a picture of Christ, I just don't want to. That's embarrassing. It's too shameful, too embarrassing to draw it almost. And yet, Christ himself was not ashamed to present that image to the world. So sometimes I think we're not willing to follow God
Yes.
in this pattern out of an almost mistaken reverence. Or we can imagine that if it's fleshly, we can't reverence it. As if God can't mediate himself to us through this. Now, let's talk a bit about religious art in churches. How does it go wrong? How does it go right? I'm happy to talk about the official teaching on this stuff, at least in Catholicism. But you've been in churches, you've looked at this stuff. In what ways do you see the use of images and artwork in churches going wrong?
Well, it's hard because they're used in different ways. And so I think to get at that, we almost have to trace back to, in the 9th century when we had the books of Charles, there was a misunderstanding of the West on what was happening out east. They thought there was idolatry happening in the worshiping of images, when really there was just the veneration of images. And so there was this critique there. And actually, that book wasn't really used or read much until you have people like the Reformers and Calvin, and then they read these texts and then bring up this understanding of the East and how, well, they were just worshiping images. So I think that's why you see within even Catholicism a different use of images. You have the more decoration versus the veneration of images within even like the Orthodox tradition. So you see a difference between Orthodox and Catholicism and how they're using images. So we could have different conversations with how we use images in our worship context, how we have images in our on the walls. So I don't know, how would you?
So I think one thing that's important, I heard you just use the word veneration and adoration. So we've got these two terms that come out of the iconoclastic debate, because this is not a new thing, and it's not even just the Reformers that wonder about this. You've got iconoclastic traditions that rise up in waves throughout Christian history, and that to me says something. And one of the things it says is, look, we can go wrong with images. So the official doctrine, East and West, is that Eastern, that is the Orthodox Church, West Catholic Church, is that religious images ought to be venerated. That is, they ought to be respected and honored. The same way, similar to the way that I've got a photo of my wife on my desk that she gave me when we were young, and it's been very special to me for years. I wouldn't spit on it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't spit on it for, you could offer me a lot of money, and I would think, no. And they'd say, well, that's not her. That's just a piece of, ink on a page or whatever. I don't actually know how photographs work, but whatever a photograph is, that's not really her. You can't do anything to her by spitting on that. And I'd say, I know that. I don't imagine this is Jenny, but it's a picture of her, and therefore it's worthy of some respect in a way that, say, a wad of, or like a piece of wrapper off some chewing gum. I might put the chewing gum in it, but I wouldn't do that to this because it's a picture of her.
Yeah, and your actions would be a symbol of something.
Without imagining that this picture is somehow actually her, or treating it loving it like I love her. Similarly, they would say we could look at, and this would be true not only for divine images, but also for things like angels and saints. Saints just means holy Christians, right? Christians who are definitely going to heaven or whatever. Well, of course I honor my father and mother. Of course I honor a bishop who teaches. He's worthy of double honor. So veneration is given to these images because they represent or show forth or are windows through which we see holy things. Adoration, given only to God.
Yeah.
Only to God.
Yeah. And that's where a lot of misunderstanding lies.
That's
so
right.
many people think that when you have images out and you're looking at them, then you're worshiping them.
That's right.
And that's not right. That's not what their confession is.
There's never been a church, a Christian church, that advocating the worship of images. It's always been condemned. But it's relevant that it's condemned, right? We don't have any condemnation of Christians. You never see papal decrees or theological treatises coming out in which we say, do not worship Zeus as if he is Jesus. Well, why don't we find that ever condemned? Why isn't this an issue that comes up over and over? Christians didn't do that. It just wasn't a struggle.
Ooh,
right?
Yeah.
So I think it's important to say there's never been a church that officially taught that it was okay to worship images. That's always been prohibited in every kind of Christianity. But I do think
Okay, all right,
I do think there are people who treat images as if they are really God itself.
Yeah, you're right. There's that, and we see that in history. Like even when Leo III, at that time, people were using those images and they were bringing them to the baptisms and saying like, this is the Godfather. Like there was this, they had gotten out of hand with images. So yeah, we do see the idolatry of images.
So if I thought how it can go wrong, that's a big one. Like they can really become idols, and it's not even like uncommon.
Yeah.
This, I think, actually happened a lot in church history, and I think happens a lot today because an idol is something we can hold. It's this worldly, and we're scared of transcendence, or it feels too far, and this is a way of getting it close or of manipulating it.
Yes.
Right?
Trying to like superstition.
Yes,
and
all that, and that stuff happens.
Yeah.
And then I think there's a reaction to that that's appropriate, that criticizes and critiques that. But there's also an overreaction that says somehow what we're looking to do is be like almost Docetists who say anything fleshly is bad.
Yeah.
First John saying, look, anyone who says Christ didn't come in the flesh is an antichrist. And if Christ didn't come in the flesh, then the flesh is nothing. It's this bad thing. We deny this image nature of God. So maybe next time when we come back, we can talk about healthy ways that Christians can find this balance and how to use art, or times in which we, like maybe you or I or people have seen Christian art and had a healthy, godly theology and been blessed by it and blessed others through it.
Yes, because I would contend that because the Incarnation was so pivotal, it not only is safe to use images, actually I think it demands images. We need to have images in the context of how we reflect on God, the nature of Christ. And so I would certainly affirm the use of images, even though we have these dangers of images being used as idols, where they conceal rather than icons that should be revealing. So I think there's a lot of revelation to be had with the use of icons.